Charlie looked at him searchingly. So what do you think is the truth? Who are you? She swallowed and started again. Who do you think I am if I'm not me? John sighed. I've thought about it a lot, he said at last. Almost constantly, actually. Charlie nodded slightly, barely moving her head like she was afraid she would spook him. I thought a lot of things, I guess. Theories. Like what? Charlie asked gently. Well, John's face was getting hot. I should never have agreed to see her. John, I guess maybe I thought you might be Sammy, he mumbled. She looked puzzled for a moment like she had not quite heard him. Then her eyes widened. Sammy's dead, she said tightly. John looked up at the ceiling and put his hands to his temples. I know, he said and met her eyes again. But, Charlie, look, I don't know that. Neither do you. The last thing you remember of Sammy, what was it? You know the answer to that, she said in a low level voice. You saw him being taken. John said it after a moment. She made no response, and he took it as a license to continue. You saw him being kidnapped, not killed, by Dave or Afton Springtrap. So, what if he wasn't killed? What if Sammy was raised by William Afton, twisted and brought up by a murderous madman to replace you, to replace Charlie after her death? Also, Sammy could be short for Samantha. I forgot that part. Sammy could have been a girl all along. Charlie was motionless across the table. She scarcely looked like she was breathing. I don't know how it sounds like I say it out loud. John added in a rush. That's why I mostly don't. Charlie had covered her face with her hand and her shoulders were shaking. She broke off as she looked up. This time she was laughing. There was a manic edge to it, like it might turn back into crying at any moment. But John tentatively tried to smile. Oh, John, she said at last, I don't even, that's crazy, right? Is it crazier than anything else we've seen? He argued without much conviction. John, you took me to see the grave yourself, remember? John paused and looked confused for a moment, trying to reconcile what he just heard. You took me yourself to see Sammy's grave. I took it to the cemetery, but I never saw Sammy's grave or your father's. John corrected. Then go look sometime. Charlie's voice was patient. John felt immediately foolish. Aunt Jen warned me not to come back to Hurricane. Charlie looked down at the table. She's 3 for 3 at this point. Have you heard from her, by the way? From your aunt? John asked, discouraged by the sudden change of subject. I figured you were living with her after you moved out of Jessica's place. Yeah, Charlie said. You were living with her? Have you seen her? Why would I have seen her? John asked slowly, suddenly feeling a bit lost in the conversation. He had just seen Jen twice, once as a child and once on that terrible night, crouched beside the twisted, broken Freddy suit in a pool of Charlie's blood. But Charlie didn't know about either. You know, I never actually met her, John said, watching Charlie's face. Her expression was pensive and did not change. I just thought she might try to get in touch, Charlie said idly. Okay, I'll let you know if she does. John offered. Please do, thanks, Charlie said. It was only then that she seemed to register his confusion. I haven't seen her in a while. She rescued me that night, she said. She took me home and cleaned me up, made sure I was okay. She flashed John a quick half smile and he returned it warily. I thought you said you do remember anything from that night, he said, trying to keep his tone from sounding accusatory. I said there was a lot I don't remember, but mostly that's what Jen told me. Honestly, the first thing I remember is her waking me up the next morning, telling me to put on the dress she had for me. Charlie made a face. She always wanted me to dress more like a girl, of course. The joke was on me. It turns out after a few near death experiences, there's nothing I wanted more than a makeover. John smiled and she batted her eyelashes exaggeratedly. He laughed in spite of himself. So you think she might be looking for you? He paused, unsure how to phrase the next part. Do you want her to fund you? He asked at last, and she shrugged. I'd like to know where she is. I'm not. She's not at the house where you're living. Then when did she leave? Everybody leaves eventually, Charlie said in a sardonic tone, and he laughed again, less heartily. You didn't answer my question. Charlie glanced at her watch. Like everything else she knew wore, it was a smaller, feminized version of the one she used to have. There's a good zombie movie starting in about 15 minutes, I think, she said brightly. The new theater isn't far from here. What do you think? Should we see if the old formula still works? What does that mean? John held back a smile. I can't go to the movies, he said with real reluctance. I got somewhere I need to be. Another time, Charlie said, and he nodded. Yeah, maybe. As he walked back to his car, John noticed a crowd outside, the new pizzeria. I guess everybody likes the circus, he thought. He wandered closer, trying to see where Charlie had gone, but she was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, like noticing hidden figures in a picture, John realized that the crowd around him was dotted with clowns, painted faces, white billowy costumes, noses of all shapes and colors. They were everywhere. He backed out of the throng, tripping on an oversized shoe and almost falling off the sidewalk. When he was free of the crowd, John took a step John took a deep breath and looked back at the restaurant, noticing for the first time the banner strung over the front entrance. Grand opening, come dressed as a clown and eat free. It read, hanging between the gigantic faces of two grinning clowns. He looked around. More people are arriving, many of them in costume, and John felt the hair over the back of his neck standing on end. He glanced behind him, but there was nothing sinister besides the clowns. He forced himself to look at them eventually. People had dressed with various degrees of enthusiasm. Some had structured bodysuits, wigs, and enormous feet. Others had simply painted their faces and worn polka dot t shirts. Still, his sense of unease did not update. They're just people in costumes, he scolded himself, then laughed abruptly. Suddenly, a woman standing nearby. People in costumes, that's never gone wrong for me, he muttered, walking away from the crowd to find his car. Driving home, John found himself agitated. Twice, he looked at the speedometer and saw he had gone dangerously over the speeding limit without noticing. He tapped his hands resting against the steering wheel, thinking of the next day. What then? Seeing Charlie that riled him more than he had realized. After months of solidarity, scribbling, going over and over his bizarre theories, he had been forced to put his conviction to the rest, to ask her questions and watch her answer and ask himself as he did, are you her? Are you my Charlie? Now that is over, it felt unreal, like a dream that lingered too long, unwelcome in the waking world. As he approached the turnoff that would take him home, he sped up, driving straight on past it. John parked his car a few blocks away from Clay Burke's house. He pulled the keys out from the ignition and jingled them nervously in his hand for a minute. Then opened the door decisively and got out. When he got to the house, it was dark except for a single window, which he thought was Clay's office. I wonder if Carlton's gone back to school. He wondered, unsure whether he was hoping for his friend's presence or his absence. He knocked and waited, then rang the bell. A long moment later, Clay opened the door. John, good, he said, and nodded, seeming unsurprised by his presence. He stepped aside to let John in and usher him into the study. You want some coffee? He asked, gesturing at the mug on his desk. It's a little late for me, John said. I'll be up all night. Clay nodded. I'm substituting lesser vices, was all he said. John glanced around the room. The last time he had been there, they used the desk as a barricade against any army of angry animatronics. You fixed the door, he observed. I fixed the door, Clay said. Oak, reinforced. What brings you here? I saw Charlie. Clay raised his eyebrows, but didn't say anything. She said something. She asked if I heard from. John stopped, seized by some sense that he was being watched. Clay had his head tilted to the side as though sensing something as well. Silently, Clay made his way to the closed window, positioning himself beside one of the long, pale green drapes and peered outside. Everyone is a little on edge with all these weirdos walking around in face paint, he said, but he kept his voice low. He pulled the drapes together, then walked back toward John. Have a seat, Clay offered. There were two dark green Anna Foster chairs and a matching couch along with one wall. John sat on the couch. Clay grabbed his desk chair and dragged it across the row so they were only a few feet apart. What did Charlie ask you? Clay began. John glanced at the window again. He felt as if waves of dread were emanating from it, rolling onto the room like an unseen fog. Clay looked back over his shoulder, but only for a second. John cleared his throat. She asked about her Aunt Jen if I've seen her. I thought you might know something, he finished uncertainly. Clay looked lost in thought, and John wondered for a moment if he should repeat himself. No, Clay said finally. Did Shirley see why she was asking? John shook his head. She just said she wanted to know if you heard from her. I don't know why I would hear from her, though. He said he was choosing his words carefully, as if saying the right ones in the right order and would unlock a door in Clay's mind and convince him to tell John what he knew. Clay just nodded thoughtfully. Did you ever meet her? John asked. Never. A formal introduction, no, Clay said. She was a bit older than Henry, I think. Clay got quiet for a moment and tilted his glass from side to side, swirling the last few slips at the bottom. When he moved here, Henry was something of a recluse. We all knew he lost a kid. Clay sat up slowly. Didn't see them for a while, even Charlie, and then Clay let out a pained sigh. Jen was around for about a year, and she was the one watching the kid. Jen stuck up to Charlie's side like glue. I guess Henry just didn't trust people anymore, and I can't blame him. I always kind of got the impression, John paused, choosing his words again. Charlie always gave me the impression that she was kind of cold. Well, like I said, after something like that, Clay said, I was surprised when Jen took Charlie after Henry died. He went on. What about Charlie's mother? John asked hesitantly. It felt intrusive to pry. Worse, because Charlie was not here. He felt like they were talking about her behind her back. No, Charlie's mother ran out before her and her father moved to Hurricane, Clay said. Henry never said anything bad about her mother. He pretty much never said anything about her at all, but I asked one day, just out of curiosity. Maybe it was detective in me. I couldn't help myself. He thought of a long time before answering me. Then he gave me this sad look and he said, she should know what to do with my little girl. I backed up the subject after that. I mean, I knew they lost another kid. I guess I assumed Charlie's mother had some kind of breakdown or else just found herself unable to care for her child so much like the one she lost. I think it should be said though, so her Aunt Jen's credit, Charlie seems to turn out all right. He smiled and gave a nod. She's a bit odd, but she's a good kid. She's unique for sure, John said. Unique then, Clay said drearily. The walls trembled briefly as a strong wind passed over the house. John cast his eyes around the room uncomfortably, then lit on something familiar in the corner, tucked away between the end of a bookshelf and the wall. Is that Ella? John asked, pointing. Clay looked blank for a moment. The doll? that turned up in the rubble of Charlie's old house. The rest got hauled away, but I kept that. Her name is Ella, John said. Charlie's dad made her. She used to go around on a track carrying a tea set. I asked Charlie if she wanted it. Clay said she wasn't interested. She wasn't? John repeated, alarmed. Clay shook his head absently. I have a hard time believing that, John said incredulously as he held the old toy in his arm, and Clay came back to attention. How's it going? Well, tell her that it's here if she ever wants it. I will, John said, setting the doll back down. Clay glanced at the window again and looked preoccupied. Is something wrong? John asked. Not at all, he said. John raised his eyebrows. Are you sure about that? Clay sighed. A child was abducted this morning. What? A little girl. She disappeared sometime between midnight and 6 a.m. Clay was stone faced. John searched for words and came up empty. It's the second one this month, Clay added quietly. I haven't heard anything about that, John said. He glanced at the window again as the wind began to hollow out side out. When then looked back at Clay, and immediately the knot of fear took up its pose behind his head again. Do you have any leads? John asked the first question he could think of. Clay didn't answer for a moment, and John asked the next question. Do you think it was something to do with, missing kids? It's not the first time that's happened here. No, it's certainly not. Clay was starting. Clay was staring into space between them as if there was something there he could see. I don't see any way it could be connected, though. Freddy's have been destroyed by this point. Right, John said. So, you don't have any leads? I'm doing the best I can. Clay lowered his head and ran his hand through his hair, then sat up straight again. I'm sorry, it got me on edge. I feel like I'm reliving those days. Children, the same age as my little boy, the same age as you back then, getting snatched one after another, and then when there was nothing I could do to stop it, then neither. Michael, John said quietly, Michael and the others. There never seems to be a shortage of evil in this world. But that's why we have you, right? John smiled. Clay snorted. Right, I wish there was a simple. You said two kids were missing, John said, his eyes drawn again toward the sound of the wind, dragging bridges and leaves against the side of the house. Clay stood up and went to the window, almost definitely, and opened it wide. John startled at the sound of the window cracking, and John could see where he sat, and Clay seemed to be scanning the area for something under the guise of something in the air. After a moment, he pulled back himself inside and shut the window, then drew the curtains close. It might not be as bad as it looks now, John. There's usually a normal explanation, and most kids turn up, one way or another. 2 weeks ago, there was a little boy named Edgar or whatever, 2.5 years old. What happened? His parents have been fighting about custody for over a year. His father ends up losing that fight, only gets to see the kid once a month. Supervised visits, which I can tell you was for good reasons. Edgar disappears. Surprise, surprise. He was found a few days later alive and well. Spontaneous road trip with his dad. Most kidnappings, it's one of the parents. Is it that what you think is happening here? John asked skeptically. No. Clay didn't take long to answer. No, I don't. He repeated, sounding graver. He took a deep breath and leaned forward. And it doesn't help that the whole town's obsessed with this new restaurant, dressing up like clowns. It's a waste of time for my officers to be doing crowd control or clown control as it would here. Can I do anything? John asked, though he couldn't imagine what kind of help he could be. Not a thing, Clay said. If I'm right, I may need you, and I'll need. He stopped. Charlie, John said. You'll need Charlie. Clay nodded. It's not fair to ask of that her. Clay said. Not after everything she's been through, but I will if I have to. Yeah, John said. Clay was staring in space between them again, and John felt suddenly like he was intruding. It's getting late, he said. Yeah, well, watch yourself out there, Clay said, hesitantly standing. Do you want to take my gun? Clay said lightly. He smiled, but there was tension in his face as though he were half hoping John would take it. Don't need it, John grinned. I got I got these guns. He held a tight fist in the air and threatened the room before letting himself out. Okay, tough guy. See you soon.